Namaskar. Welcome to Moksha Media. By the way, I am Moksha Hiremat. Music is a universal language. It goes beyond the boundary of land, lady, and language. It makes a human being a happy one. It is sometimes melodious, lyrical, melancholic, blissful, and blissful, and spiritual. Of course, Hindustani classical music is not an exception to this. Dear viewers, like it and subscribe it. Hindustani classical music doesn't have that much of history, even though it bears the name of Hindustan. Hindustan classical music is emerged out of Indian classical music. Indian classical music has its origin in Vedic period. The Rigvedic slokas are chanted in a melodious way and systematic manner in Samaveda. Samaveda tells us something about the music and the way it has to be followed. For the first time, we come to know something about Nada, Nritya, and Nataka and Tada in Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra. Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra is the first consolidated text of Nada, Nritya, and Sangeeta. Till that time, there might be so many references, but Bharata Muni consolidated them and recorded them in his treatise Natya Shastra. From that time onwards, we come to know something about Nada, Nritya, and Sangeeta in a disciplined way. As the time goes on and on, Nada and Sangeeta become together and Nritya is deviated from these two things in order to create another way. That doesn't mean Nritya is entirely separated from Sangeeta and Nritya. Due to the vastness of the field, due to the action, it has to be evolved itself in a manner to make the man understand what it expresses. On and on, we come to know something about the discipline of music in Bhakti movement. The Indian Bhakti movement has its own speciality regarding the literature and composition and the music. Of course, when we come to know something about the Shaiva devotees such as Nainas and Sharanas of the 12th century, Common Era AD, they composed vachanas and songs praising Shiva in the background of Kalyani Raga, Shivaranjini Raga and Ananda Bhairavi Raga. Of course, the followers of Vishnu, that is, the devotees of Vishnu, did the same thing in composition, praising Vishnu instead of Shiva. Of course, these were the sects at that time. Especially here, we have to refer to Alvars and Haridasas. Even though at that time the concept of Hindustani music was not that much of clear, but when that foreign culture attacked the native culture of India and enforced its culture on native Indian culture, at that time the Indian classical music has seen some changes which were relevant to those situations. So the Indian classical music has identified those attacks, those forceful attacks, and in order to protect itself from such attacks, especially its culture, it has to be evolved its own method. So, some scholars at that time identified this, so they recorded these things in their texts. The scholar Sarangadeva of 13th century, under the reign of Singana of Yadava dynasty, now in modern Maharashtra, recorded these things in his text, Sangeeta Ratnakara. There he identified the differences between the Indian classical music and the music from the other land. In order to name that difference, he has used some terms in that text. Of course, till that time, most of the texts regarding Nada, Nritya, and Sangeeta were in the language of Sanskrit. Here and there, some native languages record those things, but that is not that much of. The scholarly work was done in the language of Sanskrit at that time. But after the Bhakti movement, especially in the 12th century AD, the Sharana Chalavali of Karnataka and Haridasa movement, if we call it, started to use the native language to convince the people regarding their thoughts and feelings. Especially the Sharana Chalavali, that is the Sharana movement, the devotees of Shiva's movement, used the native language Kannada at its level best. For the first time, in the strict sense, that Bhakti movement was the movement in the strict sense, because that movement affected socio-economic, political, cultural, and educational and musical aspects in the society. It is a overall development of the fields affecting the society. To a little extent, we can say this about Haridasa Bhaktas, Haridasa devotees, who used the native language, that is Kannada or Marathi or Gujarati or Tamil, to make the people to know the destination of human beings. Sharanas and Haridasas used common language to express their concern regarding the suppression, oppression, and the exploitation. At that time, the culture which was alienated to Indian entered into India and tried to exploit the Indian situation in order to acquire the property, in order to plunder the prosperity of India. So, Sarangadeva made it clear in the field of music, because the field of music is not an exception to the change taken place in the society. The socio, politico, and cultural changes have also affected the musical field. So, the music is to be changed in the changed situation. So at that time, the scholar, musician Sarangadeva identified these things in the 13th century. Of course, when the alienated culture attacked and established its rule on Indian soil, it created its own atmosphere. In the field of language, land, economy, and politics, it has used its men or its followers. So it tried to do the same thing in the field of music. Especially Delhi Sultanates controlled the Indian situation in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. Under the reign of Delhi Sultanates, the scholar Amir Khusro tried his best to coordinate the Indian classical music and a type of music which entered into India from the land of Turkey, that is Persia and Arabia. Of course, Amir Khusro was under the influence of Sufism. Sufism, even devoted to Islamic concept, tried in its own way to extract the best things and norms in other religions such as Hinduism and other sects. So he introduced many musical instruments. Of course, as the time goes on and on, some other changes were made in Indian classical music. At the time of 14th, 15th centuries AD, Indian classical music is diverged into two traditions. Those two traditions are Carnatic classical music and the Hindustani classical music. In order to differentiate the music from the native culture, the musical scholars used a term which has the influence of Persian and Arabic language and literature. As the time goes on and on, this Hindustani music, classical music, is established. Then we have two traditions in the Indian context. Those two traditions are the Karnataka classical music and the Hindustani classical music. Then what are the differences between Karnataka classical music and the Hindustani classical music? There are no such grave mistakes or grave differences between these two music traditions. Here and there, some changes may be there, but they do not have a complete change in their field. The Hindustani classical music also use Shruti, Swara, Raga and Tala as it is done in Karnataka classical music. But these Shrutis, Swaras, Ragas and Talas have their text in the language of Sanskrit, and the Persian scholars did not want to have that language in the Islamic court. That is why they tried their best to replace the Sanskrit words with Persian and Arabic words. So, due to this replacement, it seems to us there are so many changes, but not yet. The main change between the Karnataka classical music and the Hindustani classical music is that one gives importance to compositions and the other gives importance to the impromptu singing, impromptu vocal things, and to the musical instruments. Of course, both of them used the same ragas with a difference. Some of them may be used in low, middle, or high, middle, and low and high, middle and low, and middle and high, etc., as the case may be. But these are variations in the frequency of the sound. And in addition to these things, of course, some cultural differences have been introduced into Indian music, which are brought from the land of Turkey. These changes have the Persian influence. That Persian influence means Persian language and literature and composition. What is composed in Sanskrit and in Indian native languages, that is also done in Persian language, that is also done in Arabic language. But when the Persians and Arabians become the rulers of that land, automatically they want to have their own language and literature. That is what happened in the case of the music. So they introduced their technical words, replacing the native Indian words. But there is no fundamental changes as far as ragas and talas are concerned. Sometimes they may give importance to that raga or another raga or this tala and that tala. For example, they replaced the rag Kalyani with the word Yaman. And the difference between Kalyani raga and Yaman raga is not that much of. The same raga is called as Yaman in the Hindustani classical music. This is one of the examples. There may be a slight difference, but that may not be considered, that is insignificant here in this case. But actually, the main difference in Hindustani music is that it has changed the musical instruments. The musical instruments are very important in order to make the music a lovable and livable one. In Carnatic classical music, Tanpur, Veena, Mridangam, cymbal, etc., etc. are used. But in Hindustani classical music, they use sitar instead of veena. They use tabla instead of mridanga. They use shahnai instead of nadaswaram. So, many type of musical instruments have been appeared in the Hindustani classical music tradition. Whereas in the old Indian classical music, the musical instruments are limited. But in Hindustani classical music, the instruments are so many. Most of them have a different shape, producing the sound, same sound sometimes. So the Hindustani musical instruments can be classified into 4 types. That is string instruments, wind instruments, metal instruments, and of course skin instruments. String instruments are sitar, sarod, saranga, violin, mandolin, etc., etc. And metal instruments are cymbals, for example, saxophone, and skin instruments are these percussionist things, that is this tabla, mridanga, dolak, that is the tevil, kanjira, etc., etc. Of course, these instruments are used at their best level. By using these instruments, they try to show the difference between the Indian classical music and the newly emerged Hindustani classical music, even though there are no fundamental changes. Of course, in Hindustani classical music, there are so many ragas. Once someone asked Vilayat Khan, how many ragas are there in the Hindustani classical music? The Vilayat Khan replied that there may be 4 lakh ragas. We say there are 4 lakh ragas, but we do not find them. Sometimes they are repetitions, sometimes they are very short, sometimes they have even taken here and there, etc. etc. He told. That means, in order to differentiate from the old pattern of the music, these Hindustani musicians in the beginning try their best to use different type of ragas and different type of musical instruments. The Hindustani classical music is established completely in the reign of Jalaluddin Akbar, that is the great Akbar. Most of us have heard the name of Tansen. We think that Tansen is the great musician and scholar. Yes, Tansen. At that time, Akbar told him to convert Islam. It was inevitable. So he converted it and had children from her. Anyhow, whatever might be the story of Tansen's, but he was a great musician, no doubt about it. And there were so many mysteries, so many legends regarding Tansen. Whenever he played a particular raga, for example, Mega Mallara, the rain would be poured. When he played the raga, Deepak, automatically lamps were lighted, etc. etc. So it shows to what extent that Tansen had the mastery over the ragas. My point is this: at the time of Akbar, due to Tansen's efforts, the Hindustani classical music was completely established. For the first time in the history of Indian classical music, the Hindustani classical music showed its genre, showed its ability in the complete sense. So anyhow, as the time goes on and on, so many persons are used the Hindustani classical music. Of course, there is a dictum, there is a saying: who owns the land, owns the language, owns the lady. Of course, who owns language, who owns land, language and lady would also own the music. That is what happened at the time of these in the alienated culture. Of course, in order to protect from the clutches of the violent, from the clutches of violence and inhuman attitude of alienated culture, automatically the silent culture yet to evolve its own methods. Of course, the Hindustani classical music is one of them. But with that Indian classical music has not given up its sanctity of the culture. It that sanctity of the culture is survived in the form of Karnataka traditional music. So, like this, these two traditions are continued and survived on the land of India. That the Hindustani classical music has some basic elements. They are Drupad, Khyal, Tarana, and Tumri. And these are referred to the ragas. Drupad is devotional, Khyal is imaginative, Tarana is light, and Tumri is a lyrical. In these captions, the Hindustani musicians compose the songs and sing the songs. And of course, as in olden classical music, the Hindustani classical music also a principal singer who is called vocalist, an accompanist or accompanist, and percussionist or percussionist. Of course, behind the vocalist, there would be a tanpur player. In Karnataka classical music, the composition is very important. The vocal player is the principal one. It is very strict. It is very disciplined. It has to follow the things one by one, step by step. But this cannot be said of the Hindustani classical music. The Hindustani classical music is very flexible. It can change, it can make some changes very easily, but that cannot be said of in case of the olden classical music. So anyhow, these Drupads, Khayalis, Tharanas and Tumris are the different words. They are the Persian or Arabic, they have the Persian or Arabic origin. That's all. So like this, the Hindustani classical music is emerged due to the inevitable situation. It shows the imprint of the Persian and Arabic cultural entry into Indian land, and by its different cultural approach and thought, it shows its identity in India. Its dress code, its approach to life, its spirituality, its eating habits, are completely differed from the native ones. And these dress codes and the other things show they are different from others, especially that is a monotheistic concept, whereas native Indian has the multi-theistic concepts. So there is a clash between these monotheistic and multi-theistic cultures, and we cannot continue the clash forever and ever. There would be a sort of coordination between them somewhere at some point. And anyhow, they are coordinated and they are identified in the form of Hindustani classical music. Hindustani classical music gives lot of importance to musical instruments. The names of some Hindustani classical musicians are identified with those classical musical instruments. For example, Ustad Bismillah Khan for Shahnai, Dr. Zakir Hussain for tabla, Dr. Ravi Shankar for sitar, and etc. etc. These are some of the few names for our instance. The list is very long. So, like this, the journey of the Hindustani classical music goes on and on. So my point is this: due to the attack of alien culture on Indian culture, the Indian classical music is diverged into the Karnataka classical music and the Hindustani classical music. And some technical words are replaced with the words of the rulers. It happens in all the times, whether it is this or that, whether it is left, right, or center left, center right, etc. etc. These are common things, but the Indian tradition is that it does not outrightly reject any changes completely, because it has the power of assimilation, and that assimilation can be seen in the Hindustani classical music and in Hindustani vocal players and in Hindustani accompanists and percussionists. So especially so many Hindustani vocalists and instrumentalists can be quoted. In Karnataka, we have a long list of the Hindustani classical music players. We have the list of Shivaputraya, Sidramaya, Kunkhalimat. If I say this, you do not catch. If I say Kumara Gandharva, definitely you come to know that musician. Kumara Gandharva, a great scholar and musician, and who invented so many ragas and who contributed to the Hindustani classical music. Mallikarjun Mansur, Basavaraj Rajaguru, Gangubai Angal, and recently we have the followers of these great musicians such as Parameshwari Hegde, etc., etc. So many musical concerts are taken place here and there throughout the world. These musical festivals are conducted in Bangalore, Chennai, Pune, Mumbai, Delhi, Gwalior, Banaras, etc., etc. Because we have so many gharanas. Gharanas means the places, the schools where the Hindustani music is taught. That is the word used for schools in Hindustani classical music. We have Banaras Gharanas, Gwalior Gharanas, etc., etc. Of course, conducting the festivals in big cities is not that much of problem, but conducting these festivals in small towns, village like places, it is very difficult. Because these Hindustani music festivals are conducted in small places like Vannavara and Sirsi in Uttara Kannada of modern Karnataka. So there we have to appreciate their efforts in conducting these musical festivals. Because conducting a musical festival is not that much of easy as we think. So we should be grateful to persons who have been conducting these musical festivals in places like Honnavara and Sirisi in Uttara Kannada. Of course, these festivals are also conducted in America, Canada, Germany, England, and France. Nowadays, especially the world is concentrated on Indian classical music. So many persons use different ragas. A Canadian musician like Abhi V sings 73 ragas and he shows them in a YouTube exhibition, and that has become such a viral. It shows the interest of those persons in Indian classical music. So we have showed our capability in music also. This is the legend that should be carried forward on and on. Of course, this is what I wanted to share with you. See you in the next episode, and thank you. Of course, like it and subscribe it. Namaskar.